Now, we'd like to introduce our keynote speakers, Chamath Palihapitiya and Vinod Khosla. Chamath is the founder and CEO of Social Capital, whose mission is to advance humanity by tackling the world's hardest problems. Vinod is the founder of Khosla Ventures that focuses on impactful technology investments in software, AI, robotics, 3D printing, healthcare, and more. Joining them as the moderator is Kartik Talwar, one of the co-founders of Hack the North. We're so excited to have you back again, and welcome to the stream.
Chamath, Vinod, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you back.
I want to great to be here.
It is a delight for us because there's an interesting story behind how this got started. As this meeting in general, about a week ago, Chamath, you tweeted about a conversation you have with Vinod on how much you respect him and how much of an impact he's had on your career. And the anecdote I want to bring up and kind of start us off is when you were 19, you sent an email to everybody at Kleiner Perkins and asking for an internship, and you didn't get a reply back from anybody other than Vinod. And even though it was a rejection, you got a reply, and you mentioned that this was a really big moment for you, and you kept that letter for years. I wanted to sort of start us off by asking, can you share a little bit more about that story? How did that happen? How's that impacted your career in venture?
Yeah, I mean, the prelude to this was in high school. I worked at a company called Newbridge Networks, which was making, TDM and ATM multiplexers. And it was run by this guy, Terry Matthews, who had before that started this company called Mitel. And so in Ottawa at the time, there was Newbridge, there was Nortel, there was Mitel, there was all these technology companies. And so I was kind of like exposed to tech and what a startup was. And I saw the success of a startup through Newbridge. And so, I was really just fascinated with the people who were a part of that. And, it was I think it was in like my 2B work term. I was like, I want to be a VC. And so I kind of just, you Google and you get pretty quickly to Sequoia and Kleiner's websites. And so I thought I would just email everybody. Or I think I sent a letter, actually, to be honest, a paper letter. But the point is that, in all of that, I got a letter back on Kleiner Perkins letterhead. Basically saying, listen, I don't hire summer interns, but good luck to you. Kind of something to the effect of good luck to you. Let's stay in touch. I mean, had I had a smartphone, I would have even taken a picture of it, right? I mean, we're talking 2001. No, sorry. We're talking 1990. Oh my God, 1996, 1995. Some of you may not have even been born. Yeah, it was just wonderful to get a response because, so basically the story is like, Vinod had started Sun and then left. And there was an article that somebody wrote about him as he was starting Kleiner. And at the time, things were really ramping. He had done Cerent and Sierra. I mean, I know all the deals that he did. This is how much like I had been obsessed about this. He'd done all this stuff in optical networking. And again, I had come from telecom, so I kind of understood it a little bit. Okay, so there was this article that said that he had become obsessed with networking, in this transition out of Sun and before he went to Kleiner. And the article said that he would fly back and forth to India and he would just bring a bag of books and he would read them on the plane. And so for whatever reason, I still remember this story. And VK, you probably don't even know this article, but it was like in Fortune or Forbes or something. And that was the impetus for me to want to for me to try to contact him because I was like, wow, this guy sounds like a badass. I got a no, but and that meant a lot too, just because it's like you feel seen, and here we are.
Let me just add a few comments to this. I had a similar moment for myself when I was 15 in India. and we'd go to Old Delhi. I was lived in the military part of Delhi cantonment, and I'd go to Old Delhi every weekend to go rent old magazines, because this was the only way you got access to magazines. And I read a story about Andy Grove, a Hungarian immigrant, starting Intel. I must have been 15. And I said, boy, that's cool. I want to do that. I want to start my own company. Now, be fair, I was in the Indian Army. My father and family were in the Indian Army. I'd actually never known anybody in business or technology. And I fell in love with the idea. So I had my own role model in Andy Grove. And that started it off. There's probably another question in here that Chamath's story brings out, which is, yes, I did go to India before my eldest kid was 5 and my youngest kid was 10 days old. And I was a Kleiner. We moved the whole family to India, and I'd go back and forth every 6 weeks because I wanted my kids to know their grandparents and the Indian environment. And before starting school seriously was the best time to do it. But what's interesting about it, and this was 93, I had 40 hours of flights, each 20 hours each way every 6 weeks. And I always thought the best way to use that time is learn something new. And I vividly remember reading about the internet and where things were going. Now, the internet was this other thing. There were these new things called bulletin boards. If any of you, most of you are probably too old, too young to remember that. But my point is, curiosity and role models make a huge difference.
Yeah. Chamath, that's absolutely incredible. I just want to kind of preface this to our audience, all the students. So we're going to split this in 3 sections. We're going to talk about life and risk taking. We're going to talk about just the future of tech, and we're also going to then cover career and just where education is going. And we'll then have a Q&A section for our keynotes here. So if you have any questions, you can just put them on Hopin or on Twitter or any other social media we're using, and we'll be able to collect them and ask them at the end. So as you see a lot more interesting anecdotes that you hear from our Vinod and Chamath, be sure to write them down and post them so we can collect them and ask them in about 40 minutes. Those are really interesting points, and I think that's super meaningful, especially when you are super young or in university, and that sort of belief that somebody has in you really impacts how your career moves on. Vinod, I wanted to kind of dig a bit deeper into what you just said. You've also been very persistent and driven throughout your careers. There's been numerous interviews I've seen where you've talked about just sitting at the client's lobby and waiting for them to come in so you can close a deal, to one time where you showed up at Stanford because you didn't get in, and hoping that somebody would just not show up and you may be able to take their spot. How sort of did that end up happening, and sort of where does that persistence come from? Was there a key motivator behind that?
There's really 2 kinds of people, I think, fundamentally. When something's hard, some people focus on why it can't be done, and others ask, how can it be done? I've just always belonged to the second category. So I sort of say, think everything can be done till proven otherwise. And because of that, to be honest, I will tell your audience, I have probably failed at more things than anybody in that audience or anybody I've met personally, because I tried many more things. You are referring to the story. The real story is I applied to business school when I was at Carnegie Mellon doing my master's in biomedical engineering. I applied to business school at Stanford because I wanted to get to the Silicon Valley and start a company. And they turned me down because I didn't have work experience. So while I was at Carnegie, I got 2 full-time jobs. and they were truly full-time, 40 hours a week jobs. And I applied again the next year because they told me I needed 2 years of work experience. So I got 2 years of work experience in 1 year. We can come back to this issue of overconfidence. I had overconfidence. They turned me down again the second time. They didn't think it was funny that I got 2 years of work experience. And so I decided I'd wage a campaign, and I got to know everybody in the Stanford Business School admissions office, and frankly, just kept talking to them. The director of admissions put me on the wait list just to get me to stop bugging him. I don't think he had any intention of letting me in. And once I was on the wait list, I kept track of which candidates had accepted and which had declined admission. And I kept this up. School at Carnegie Mellon starts in the first week of September, right after US Labor Day. I actually joined the business school at Carnegie Mellon as a backup strategy, but still kept harassing Stanford. And then one of the women in the admissions office told me this student was dropping out about 3 or 4 days before classes started. This was 3 weeks. It was probably around September 20th. I was already 3 weeks into my classes at Carnegie Mellon MBA program. And I called the admissions officer and said, look, this person's dropped out. I'm coming. And I literally showed up the next day. Didn't worry too much that I had no way to pay my fees or pay my rent. This woman actually put me up in our house because I didn't have a place to stay. And that was the true story. But, you know, I never gave up on the idea that I'd get there because I wanted to do a startup in Silicon Valley, even in 1978.
That's absolutely amazing. And I think this is not just an example of persistence, but also risk-taking. And maybe just I'll kind of flip that to Chamath. Chamath, you have very strong views on and similar points on how risk-taking should be done, as you've kind of talked at this event for the past couple of years, but also just online. And you've been extremely successful in taking several risks across various industries, whether that's healthcare or space exploration or enterprise software, and not just on the venture side, but also on just other personal life areas like poker. How do you kind of think about risk-taking yourself from a career standpoint, and sort of what parallels do you see on how that is similar to Vinod's perspective on life?
Well, I think VK and I have one very powerful thing that was going for us when we were young, which is that neither of us had much to lose. And I think that is an incredible gift, actually. You know, if you think about it, like, what is the worst that happens? Okay, he gets rejected and then he continues at CMU. He still would have been Vinod Khosla, in my opinion, but the point is he didn't have much to lose. You know, in a lot of the times in my life, the risks that I've taken, I could pretty easily underwrite, because in failure, you know, I would have learned something. It would have been an interesting thing, and you know, I would have moved on. And these were never life or death decisions. And so I think the thing that I've really been blessed with is, you know, not really having high expectations. And that is a gift. That sounds kind of crazy, but it's not. If you think about, you know, what is it like to be Bill Gates' children? It's hard. You got to think it must be super, super, super hard. You know, what is it like to be Elon Musk's kids? It will be very, very hard. So I think that, you know, we benefited from, you know, being immigrants to a completely different country where, you know, chutzpah is rewarded, where, you know, probably nobody could pronounce his name at the time, and nobody can still pronounce my name today. It's okay. And I think that's really nice. You know, it keeps you grounded and it keeps you grinding. And then all of a sudden risk is, you know, what Vinod said earlier is so true. It's like you can try so many things and learn so much because you can frame things in just a very different way, which is sort of like knowledge and wisdom. And the pursuit of that is so much more interesting than, accolades and the like. So I don't know. I really think it comes down to making sure that you are not convincing yourself that you have so much to lose.
Yeah, Chamath said something I want to emphasize. You can focus on accolades in life. And I think one of the fundamental issues I see in law change is most people do what is expected of them. It could be career, getting into the right school, getting the next promotion, working at a name brand company. So you can do what expectations others set for you, or you can do what you believe in. And I've never really worried what others think. I've sort of focused on what I believe in and tried to pursue that. And I'd urge all of you to think about what you really believe in. Now, I'll be honest, I'd be shocked if even 5% of you did what you believed in versus what your parents, friends, others expect you to do. And that's a really important test to put yourself through. And I actually fundamentally believe people are happier when they do what they believe in as opposed to what's expected of them, whether it's promotions or careers or big titles or better cars or better houses or whatever you think.
No, that's, I think this is like a really interesting point that helps set the base for the next topics we have, because you're fundamentally describing your upbringing, setting you up for what you're doing now, and that gives you a much bigger tolerance for what you can lose or what you may be left with. And this is kind of where I want to focus on a section that's specifically around just the future of technology. You've been really pioneers in investing in industries that nobody would look at or maybe look at 10 years later. And we have a questions around just where that's going, especially as the last 12 months have been very interesting for the rest of the world. And to talk about that, I want to bring on Liam Horn, who's also one of the co-founders of Hackathon North.
Can I just make a comment on,
Absolutely.
before we go on to the next topic, on this risk-taking issue? Because I think there's a very, very important lesson in my story. Most people don't realize that when I started Sun with Scott McNeely, we started another company a month earlier. And when I see audiences like this, I always ask them, do you remember what company I started and failed at?
Crazy.
And nobody can tell. It was a company called The Data Dump. And my point is the following. Your failures don't matter if they're manageable failures. My life wasn't going to end if the data dump failed. I'd be a little bit behind on my rent, but I'd pick up and start again. And we started both Data Dump and Sun about a month apart, same founders. And my point is, failure doesn't really matter if it's not going to kill you. Success, on the other hand, everybody remembers 40 years later. And it changes your life. And frankly, the failures also are probably one of the more important learning moments in your life. So I just want to emphasize what seems like a large risk may actually, in the context of 10, 20, or 30 years, be a very small risk because nothing about you changes. Maybe you're a little bit smarter. That's about it.
Right.
Okay, wait, hold on. Kartik, I have a question for Vinod.
Yeah.
Okay, what are your relationships like and what are your memories like of those early days at Sun and like working with Andy and Bill and Scott? Like what do you remember? Like what makes you nostalgic about that?
Well, I think, look, it was really my first real job. I'd done another startup called Daisy Systems, which was also quite successful, went public. But it was the first time I actually got to understand what people are like and how important people are. Daisy had great outcome, not great people. And I could go into those stories that take forever. Sun, you realize people had very different perspectives. The four founders at Sun were so different in both their beliefs, their upbringing, where they came from, how they thought. And I got to appreciate that quite a bit. And that's probably the most vivid learning. The other learning, which may be relevant to your audience, one of the very unusual things, and I had no idea what I was doing, but I insisted on hiring everybody really good, mostly because I just wanted to talk to them. So if you look at, and I've been meaning to do this, out of the first 15 people, how many billion-dollar companies were started? My bet is Sun was as successful, maybe more successful than PayPal, which is cited as a recent example. But not only that, we hired people. Eric Schmidt, we hired in our first year. It was in 1982 that he came to work for me as VP of Engineering. Carol Bartz, who went on to be CEO of Autodesk and Yahoo, was in our first 15 people. There were at least, out of the 15 people, at least a dozen companies were created. And it speaks to the question you asked, which is, I realized how much talent matters, whether you need them or not in the current context. Because when we were so small in our first year, we didn't need a lot of the talent. We were telling a machine and selling it. We hoped someday to do distributed file systems, but nobody cared. Nobody wanted distributed file systems. But we hired the people just to play around. So I always say my favorite saying is there's a huge difference between a $0 million company and a $0 billion company. And that's how you think about yourself and how much you hire, whether you hire in the ilk of a $0 million company or a $0 billion company. And they're different teams. Most people don't realize that when Sun started, Andy Bechtolsheim was a graduate student at Stanford. He developed sort of the Sun workstation idea. He had licensed it to 6 other people at $10,000 a pop. And Andy, when I approached him, I said, I want you to give up your PhD and join me. He said, I'll license it to you. It's only $10,000. And I said, I'd rather split my equity with you. I'll split my equity with you, but I want the goose that laid the golden egg. I just don't want the golden egg. And that, in retrospect, made all the difference in the world. Because it wasn't the golden egg that mattered. It was his class of thinking, his style of thinking, his constant evolution. And I still learn from him whenever I talk to him.
Wow, that's a really interesting
That's amazing.
that memory lane.
By the way, one of the 6 startups was funded by John Doerr at Kleiner Perkins, a company called Symlink.
Wow.
But I had the person who could keep doing what he had done in designing the Sun workstation.
So I think this is the right time to dig into what the next few decades may look like. So I'll let Liam Horn hop in.
Cool. Thanks so much, guys. And again, this is so awesome to see, having been able to see you guys at previous Hack the Norths over the years. And what I wanted to kind of take the conversation towards is the future. And the thing that shocked me, now I'm 6 years into my career, maybe 7 years into my career, is that, when Kartik and Kevin and I were starting Hack the North and we were there with all these engineers and these students, we were just kind of dreaming about what we wanted to build in our careers. But then, it went really quickly. And a lot of people that I met at Hack the North and friends that I, got at Hack the North are now founding companies. They're making really ambitious bets in technology themselves. They've joined ambitious startups, and they're actually the ones building the future. So what I want to try to get at is, what are the things that you think are important for the students in the audience to be thinking about in the future? I want to start with Vinod. Basically, it's a pretty awesome question. Is why do you think right now is a great time to be excited about the future, and what are you excited about?
Chamath, you want to go?
No, go ahead, VK. You start.
So I'm sort of very fortunate, but I've always viewed it this way. When I did my first startup, I figured McDonald's was a pretty good meal. I didn't have a lot of expectations. I had a one-bedroom studio in San Jose, and I felt like I was very comfortable in life, and so I didn't need a lot of income. About a few years ago, when I turned 60, I'm 65 today, I had sort of the same kind of, I don't need any more. What should I work on? Retiring seemed like a really boring idea. Sailing sounded boring. Beaches sounded boring. Said, what should I work on? What would motivate me? And I actually wrote a 50-page document called Reinventing Societal Infrastructure with Technology. The basis for that was, I thought, well, it'd be nice to take on large problems and work on them. And so I started thinking about what I could work on. And I took all of US GDP and asked the question, what parts could be radically innovated with technology? And I was shocked to learn, and this was over an August break I had, that there was no part of non-governmental GDP that I couldn't think, sitting there alone, think of ways to renovate and radically innovate. And by that, I mean not 5, 10, 20, 30% improvements, but 100, 300, 1,000% improvements. So the good news for all of you is this document, which is 50 pages long, I published in Medium about 3-4 years ago, says that there is almost nothing that can't be radically reinvented. Whether it's space, and we did Rocket Lab about 4 or 5 years ago, whether it's 3D printing houses, which we are doing, whether it's reimagining food like Impossible Foods, which we did. They're really, and in fact, my most recent project is one of the most exciting things, reinventing public transit. Like, take on a large problem and say, how could you do it very, very differently with technology? And the problem I ended up formulating for myself was pretty simple. I said, about 700 million people on the planet live a rich lifestyle. And by that, I mean rich in education, rich in energy, the cars we drive, rich in housing, rich in entertainment, rich in healthcare. It's a rich lifestyle. Now, 7 billion people want it, and you can't go from 700 million to 7 billion by linear extrapolation. We'd kill the planet if we took 10 times more steel, 10 times more cement. So that was the pieces. And what was shocking to me is I was able to figure out how one might approach having 1/10 amount of cement used for the same amount of housing. 1/10, or materials at least. Cement is too restricting. 1/10 the carbon emissions, 1/10 the amount of steel, 1/10 the amount of land area for food production. All that actually, I was shocked and I was really excited. So, health permitting, I sort of have a very clear plan the next 25 years. And for public consumption, it's in this document called Reinventing Societal Infrastructure with Technology. So it can be done. People always say, start as naysayers, how can you change food? How can you change housing? you can, and a lot of it is defined in this document. So hopefully it's motivation. By the way, 6 years ago, I'd written a different document called 20% Doctor Included. I said, how would I change medicine? And I'd looked at this problem coming from India as the following way. And I'd started the very linear way to think about it. Hey, the doctor-patient ratio in the US is X. If I want the same ratio, how many doctors do I need in India? In 30 years, could I start enough medical schools and train enough professors to teach at those schools, and how many doctors would we have? Even if I had an unlimited budget. And the answer I came up was it wasn't possible. And so the greatest thing is when you run into a problem that's not solvable. That's when 11 years ago, I first wrote a blog called Do We Need Doctors? It came from this analysis. And then I evolved the thesis around how AI could do most of medicine. And that I wrote a 100-page detailed thesis called 20% Doctor Included, which is also on our website, on how to change medicine, how to make it 10x cheaper and substantially higher quality. So I've been working on that also. So my point is the following. Almost every area is open for innovation, and you guys, young people, have many more tools than we had. So the pace of innovation will accelerate and the opportunities will accelerate. Sorry, Chamath, I should let you talk.
No, that's good. My version of this is I'm governed by, at first, what I would have called a lot of anger and insecurity, and now I would say is more motivation, which is this idea of evening the starting line. So a lot of the things, the projects that I do, I'm motivated to answer this question. Will it even a starting line? Will it make it more fair for everybody? And to be really honest with you, in the first version of Social Capital, it was sort of one day waking up and realizing I was spending so much time. I talked to Vinod about this 2 weeks ago, like in, approving enterprise software investments, thinking to myself, this is a horrendous waste of my life, quite honestly. Not that enterprise software is bad, but to me, it just didn't. It didn't meet this simple boundary condition. So the things that I think about a lot now are things where I can accelerate ideas that sort of already exist, but do it in a better way that I think the result is an even starting line. So there's a lot of reasons why, for example, I've spent some time in space. It's because the innovation cycle in space, because of the boundary conditions, because of the physics, it's so difficult that you can elegantly degrade those technologies to be useful, near the surface of the Earth. And so, for example, suborbital space flight is a precursor to intercontinental hypersonic flight, as an example, right? So you take a 15-hour flight and you make it 45 minutes. That's incredibly transformational for GDP, as an example. I'm really fascinated in the move to climate change, and specifically, we have a huge problem, which is the geopolitics around climate change are very complicated. And the underlying implication there is that, access to the raw input materials are going to be constrained over the next 20 or 30 years. So back to what Vinod said, it's so true. If you have an imperative to get to carbon neutrality because of rising sea levels or, migration patterns or food insecurity and political insecurity, and you can't get access to the raw materials because China decides to not give it to you, it's a really big problem. And so I've been spending a lot of time learning about material science, new polymers, new synthetics, new composites, ways in which we can really radically improve what happens today. And so those are sort of like the lenses in which I look at things. But in all of these things, at least 1 or 2 degrees from whatever I find interesting in the moment must be this answer. Does it even a starting line somehow? And I think that's actually, it's not a very ambitious technological goal per se, but I think it is the governing motivator for a lot of people, is sort of closing this gap of inequality that people feel. And I think that if that doesn't happen in the next 20 years, you're going to have a lot of regressive politics that will slow everything down. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about things right now.
I would agree with Chamath. The single biggest risk society faces, I think, is the inequality. The second biggest risk society faces is climate change. And I put it second only because we have a little more time to solve it. But I think the politics of inequality can be explosive, and we've seen some of it, but only the beginning. When people ask me about a country like India, I say the most dangerous thing we can do is leave, for example, the Muslim population behind, which is unfortunately happening. So those are two very large problems, and in fact, when I turned 40, I actually looked at both these problems, say, what should I spend my time on? And I ended up doing a lot of work with Professor Yunus, very, very worked closely with him, and spent a lot of time on the microfinance. We still probably do, we as a venture fund will never invest in a technology that's socially negative. We'll do some neutral things. But I personally spend all my time on socially positive things. Now, climate is the other big issue. Many of you think of me as a climate investor. And it's a much simpler problem. A few months ago, I actually, and this piece of encouragement to your young audience, I think to solve climate, you only need a dozen entrepreneurs. And I defined in this blog sources of 80 to 90% of all emissions on the planet and the dozen technologies that could solve them. And I'll give you an example. QuantumScape is a battery company, did a SPAC about 2 months ago. Now we're 20 billion. But we started with the idea that we needed to make electric cars cheaper and more convenient than internal combustion engine cars. So the charging time for a car, we set at, if you go to a gas station, pop in to buy a soda and come out, your car's charged. It should be able to do that. And it has to cost half as much and go twice as far. And QuantumScape's done that. Took a long time, took 10 years. We have a similar project in aviation fuel, which is a large source of carbon emissions in a company called LanzaTech. Impossible Foods was this effort to free up 80 to 90% of the land area for animal husbandry. That was how that project started. We have another project to make cement without carbon emissions. It's probably a radical project that I'm really, really excited about. I'm almost certain the technology will work. But we also have a project to use 1/5 the amount of materials in 3D printing buildings using photopolymers. So there are unusual solutions to all this. To be honest, the only area I can't yet define a clear path to carbon emissions is HVAC. Heating and air conditioning is the one area where I haven't seen a breakthrough. Almost all other areas, at least you can say this path is worth investigating. But I'd urge people to look at this climate blog I wrote about the approach we need to take. It's much simpler than it's made out to be. And I cover most emissions in this blog.
That's great. Thanks so much. You also touched on a lot of the types of things I wanted to get into detail on. And so what I think would be great actually is to transition to the next section, which Kevin will introduce, around thinking about your career and how you actually think about working on those problems.
Hey guys, it's great to see you both again here, Vinod and Chamath. Yeah, I wanted to pivot quickly over to kind of more like college focused, just given kind of the audience. So in thinking about how I guess one should spend their time in college as a student, Vinod, the last time you were at Hack the North, one thing that really stuck with me is you really advocated for something that you call a liberal sciences education, which roughly speaking, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like students should spend a lot of time investing in a strong foundational understanding in the STEM subjects. In addition to the more liberal arts kind of education where you learn how to think, write, and communicate. And to the extent that you've described, like liberal arts in and of itself on its own is sometimes useless. So I actually first want to get Chamath's thoughts on this, because Chamath, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about education as well. So yeah, for the college kids out there.
I was never a particularly good student. I mean, I was reasonably good, but not particularly good. I felt very constrained in my electrical engineering degree because I didn't have any electives. I had like 4 or 5 through the whole program. And so it took me a long time to figure out what I liked. I think that people's brains are fundamentally different today than they have ever been. I think that, you talk to a 19-year-old, they're multitasking 5 separate things at the same time. I just think that their ability to concentrate is different. And so the way that they learn has to be different. I'm not sure in 20 years people will be reading books. I think that people will be reading, or hearing, Blinkist audio summaries of books. So things are moving to more smaller and smaller quantum. And so I think that there has to be a way in which education allows you to meander more. Like a lot of my nights and evenings are spent reading. I read an enormous amount. But it's like, reading something, I'll read one of VK's blogs, I'll end up on, Wikipedia, then I'll end up reading a scientific paper, then I'll end up over here. Next thing you know, like 4 hours have gone by, but I feel more educated. The problem is I can't prove to anyone that that's happened. And so I agree with him. Like there's a certain amount of learning that has to be rote and measured in a typical way, because those are very good building blocks. And I think STEM is that foundational building block. But I do think we need to find a way for people to be more curious and meander. And I think in that you'll find these things that matter to you, the things, as Vinod said, that you believe in. And it took me a really long time, but I found it. So my presumption is most people, at least of my generation or VK's generation, have never found it. Yours is probably the path where, because you're iterating so quickly, you could find it faster. And so to find it in your 20s and 30s is such a huge win, because then you're compounding knowledge in the thing you believe in for 50 years versus 15 years. So I don't know, skip school, go on Wikipedia.
Vinod, any response to what Chamath is saying?
Yeah, so let me clarify, because it was 4 or 5 years ago, I essentially wrote a blog. It was in Medium, so people can still find it, saying, is liberal arts a waste of time, basically? And I argued it was, because what a liberal education was intended to be wasn't what liberal arts programs were today. So my critique wasn't behind the original thinking behind liberal arts. In fact, I referred to, if I remember right, it's been a while, the original purpose of liberal arts education was to be an intelligent citizen in Greece, if I'm not mistaken. And so what I defined was, what would your education be if the main goal was not necessarily STEM? And by the way, the sciences were part of the liberal arts, almost never used today in the definition of a required liberal arts curriculum. My 2 bases were, 1, your education forms the basis of learning. You don't learn things, especially in undergraduate education. You build the basis to learn any new thing you want to learn. The second was how to be an intelligent citizen, something I called modern thinking. And I suggested that the name liberal arts which is now meant to be in college, a way to get through college easily, and turn it into a rigorous program called the Modern Thinking. So you could read something like The Economist. And whether it was an article on the arts or an article on the world economy or politics or science, you could have an intelligent understanding and ask intelligent questions. I think that's what I argued for in this blog. Unfortunately, most liberal arts students who didn't get a thorough education didn't even understand what I was saying, which proved my point. I wasn't arguing for an engineering education, but a very different education. So you can't do philosophy without doing philosophical logic first. For example, you can do a second language, which can be pretty worthless, or you could do linguistics, which actually is a much more important mental model to have in your head as you go about learning in the future. So it was a fairly nuanced kind of blog, and I still believe that.
Awesome. I guess to riff off of that, one other thing that at least was top of my mind, and I'm sure is top of mind for a lot of people, when they're making decisions for where to put their career geographically, is that location bit, right? And so in the last couple of months, we've definitely seen lots of people being very vocal about leaving Silicon Valley to go to other places like Texas or Miami. And I'm interested in what you guys think. Like, what does that mean for the future of Silicon Valley? And if either of you could if we're, I guess, in the shoes of a college student and we're about to start your career, like in a couple months, at first job out of college, like where geographically would you go? Chamath, we can start with you.
Honestly, I would still come to the Valley. I think that, all of this is much ado about nothing in many ways. I just think that people are spending an enormous amount of time, talking about where they're going to zoom into meetings of engineers in Silicon Valley from. So I just think the whole thing's a fucking joke. It's not. This is all window dressing. Look, at the end of the day, this has been the heartbeat. It will change over time. But I remember the first day I got here, as a kid from Canada, and I was in Silicon Valley for the first time, and I was like, wow, I'm here. This is it. And I've told this story before, but I was driving on the 101. This is right before the 101 highway. This is right before the internet bubble burst, and Forbes had bought a huge ad as soon as you entered Menlo Park that said, high octane capitalism ahead. It's the craziest things you remember 20 some odd years later. But this is the place. The people are incredibly special. I think San Francisco may have lost its way a little bit, but people in the Valley have always been kind of grinding on interesting things. The other, there'll always be other places to go, but I wouldn't worry about that decision. I would just try to get here, find some interesting people, work at an interesting company, learn, and then take some risk. But I wouldn't be running to some of these places just because you're going to be one of the very few, and you're almost there to prove a point, which I just think misses the mark.
Yeah, I would agree completely with Chamath. In fact, it was in 2005 or so that Larry Ellison said innovation is dead. I don't know how many people remember that. And so when Oracle decided to move its headquarters from Silicon Valley, my tweet was, I'm glad to see it because it makes room for newer, younger, more innovative minds than an old ossified company like Oracle. So we do need to make room for newer people, and I'm sort of glad the phenomena is happening. It makes room for all of you to come here. Look, most of the learning you do will be from friends, from acquaintances, from company. It won't be formal meetings over Zoom. It'll be the community you live in, the talks you can go to, the Stanford professor or whoever you can listen to, or the entrepreneur. And that activity is still in the Valley more so than other places. I like to say Silicon Valley isn't a place, but it's a culture. It's a permissive culture. And it's a culture where if you're a senior executive at a big company, it's generally a bad thing. And if you're a young, scrappy entrepreneur, it's a good thing, socially speaking. And that culture can be duplicated in other places and starting to happen. Israel has some of that. I've noticed some of it around Toronto and Waterloo. You see it in Bangalore a little bit, Shanghai a little bit. So it will happen, and I think the world will be a better place if more of this happens in other places. But Silicon Valley is still the place where you get the most. And if I were young, this is where I'd want to come. Like I wanted to come here, 40 some years ago.
Awesome. Okay, so
it's mostly because who you can learn from and the interactions you can have.
Yeah, the people definitely do make the place. So just kind of one more thing kind of in closing. Now we're kind of running up against time now. So as you both know, there's roughly like 3,000 people kind of watching this live stream right now. They're about to embark on a 36-hour journey of creation through this hackathon. And most of them are kind of like the 18 to 21-year-old student type demographic who are interested in like building things in science and technology. So for closing thoughts, like Vinod, I'd love to start with you. What kind of career advice would you want to leave with these students who are, if they're considering like going to a large, big tech company versus joining a startup?
So look, I'm biased. I'm sort of startups by religion. You know, there's good training you can get in somewhat larger companies. Size doesn't matter, but the rate of change in the environment you get into. So if you get to Google in some area that's changing rapidly, you're going to learn a lot more than if you go into an area that's static. And, you know, if you look at Oracle SQL database, it's a pretty static area. You can go to other places that are much more dynamic in the same area. So I think the rate of change matters, and you learn more when there's more change. I would say smaller companies, there's less permission needed to learn more things. So that generally improves your learning. And learning from others is very valuable. I would say one thing broadly. I like to say the future is not knowable, but it's discoverable and it's inventable. In this model, you have to mentally think about you don't know where you're going except directionally, and you try lots of things, you fail in small ways, and then hopefully get successful in a large way. Nassim Taleb has written a lot about this asymmetry as being critical. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So you want to make sure you don't get killed. But generally, you can discover the future or invent it. And I like to tell people, don't extrapolate the past, invent the future you want. And it's much more doable than people think. I also fundamentally believe most people can do much more than they think they can. And they're limited not by what they can do, but what they think they can do.
I would tell you, do not go to the big tech companies. The thing that's changed is that these big tech companies now use money basically as green mail. And so the worst thing you can do in your early career is to all of a sudden get addicted to $500,000 a year, and as a result, become so lazy as to have a chance of missing out on 500 million. And I think that that's very likely because these companies now basically pay you so much to go into static businesses, to do nothing, but you make enough where you get disillusioned and you get risk intolerant. But the problem is that there is so much asymmetric upside for anybody to take risk when they're in their early 20s. And it just decays over time unless you prepare and train your mind to have that mindset. And so where I would have told you 10 or 15, 20 years ago, there was enough dynamic change to keep big companies honest, it was worthwhile going because you would have gotten some good training. Here now, the very large companies, I think, are extremely static. I think that they use money as a way to take very talented, smart kids and basically put them on the bench so that they never really exercise their full capability. It's tragic. And so I would go to startups. I would not go to these big tech companies.
Yeah, I like to say, to reinforce that idea, most interesting things happen at the edges of a system, not in complete chaos and not in ossified conventional wisdom or old companies or where the rate of change is small. So seek out those edges where things may be changing. In the second thing I would say is I've seen no large change driven by a big company or a large institution of any sort. It's almost always the entrepreneurs driving large change.
Awesome. Vinod, Chamath, thank you so much. I will pass it over to Kartik. We've been collecting some audience questions through our socials that we'd love to pass on to you guys now. So back to Kartik.
Thanks, Kevin. So to all of you watching, we've started to get some questions. I think we just switched too early on the slides. Can we go back to, there we go. We already got a handful of questions and we're gonna be collecting more. So if you have any questions, type them up quickly on Hopin. There's a consistent theme here around planning your career post-graduation. So I'll kind of bring up a couple of them and maybe I'll just list all of them so you can make a coherent narrative that sort of answers a lot of them together. I think that the first kind of question that we have here is kind of what advice would you give to somebody who's currently feeling lost in their university career and wants to explore more than one path of what their future can be? And kind of similar to that, the other theme here is, does it matter if you don't really perform at the highest level, whether that's being able to meet the criteria for the highest marks or being able to get the job at the best place right now? How do we kind of merge and think through that as somebody's thinking about their careers after university?
Well, that has to do with, one is just the motivation of, again, believing in oneself is about like building up your own self-worth. That's a mental health exercise that is about ignoring how other people define success. It would be nice to get the best grades. Not, only one person can be at the top of the class by definition. And so, what are the rest of us supposed to feel? Well, hopefully the rest of us are supposed to feel okay with ourselves because that's not the only definition of success. That's and so I think that what this person is asking is something bigger than grades or work or whatever, which is that tying back to this generation of people in your 20s, again, I think are neurologically very different than us, and as a result are much more prone to mental health issues. And the reason is because the inputs and the motivations and all of the ways in which you consume information are so radically different. And so, there's hundreds of thousands of millions of people giving you signals every day. And I don't know how I would be growing up that way. I was lucky to grow up with not a lot of that input, and so I could develop myself more. And so I do think that, focusing on how you define success, your own self-worth, is just a critical building block now that's on par with anything else. And people use the language of that question, I think, to mask what is really more of a mental health exercise, which is like, if you go to the gym, you should be also doing this. It's just that important. If you're eating reasonably good food, you should also be doing this. And what this is figure out a way to define your self-worth. I think it's a very important exercise for people.
Yeah, I said earlier, you want to be internally driven, not driven by expectations of others for you. I think that's what Chamath just said. I would answer with some additional guidance. First, there's a good balance between really focused and exploratory. And earlier in your life, exploring multiple areas is not a bad thing. I actually suggest everybody doing computer science also do neuroscience. Just learn across disciplines. And this isn't a license to not do anything. it's a suggestion that the main focus should be your rate of learning. So as you try different things, if you're lost, you focus on what are you learning, how rapidly, and maybe use that as a guidance. At some point, you also have to take responsibility and get some things done. But there's a balance between exploration and learning and getting things done. But especially early, especially at 20, I wouldn't be too worried about lack of focus if your rate of learning is high.
Amazing.
And it's not a license to be lazy. It's a license to work hard at a lot of other things that you might learn from.
This is great. I think, Vinod, there's a question for you from one of the answers you gave, and that is, if you believe that the focus on inequality is the biggest problem that we should solve, how can students get started to contribute towards solving that?
There's no one answer to this. I wish there was. If you ask me the question, is there one answer in 25 years? Yes, in my view, there is. I think some of the technologies, AI among them, will make the production of goods, services, etc., relatively free, and we won't have to worry about this notion of income. So the least common multiple of goods, services, and the richness of lifestyle will be much, much higher, multiplied by the technology I've talked about. So between now and then, we can't let it wait for 25 years or 2045 for that to happen. We have to pay attention to the issue and work hard on it. About 5 years ago, I wrote a piece in Forbes saying AI will cause great disruption, great productivity growth, great GDP growth, and increasing income inequality. That was about 5 years ago, the first time I wrote about universal basic income. I do think notions like that will have to happen, and anything that enhances that. In the meantime, I think, especially in the West, especially in the Americas, we are well off enough where just GDP growth is the wrong metric. I actually suggested in a tweet last year that we stop measuring GDP and start measuring the total income of the bottom half of the population as the key metric for policy.
It's amazing. I think definitely one of the criticisms of GDP is it doesn't account for what the internet's done directly either. So I absolutely agree with that.
Lots of reasons are wrong with GDP, but if policy is geared towards maximize the income of the bottom 50%, you might still see inequality, by the way, but you'd see the minimum standard of living much higher and improving, and the main purpose of policy.
Amazing. So the next question is for you, Chamath. Why are you excited about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies?
Well, I mean, I think, look, if you go back to 18 whatever, we are in a world where the dollar just fundamentally debases naturally as you print more money. Like literally by printing more, we actually make every single existing one worth slightly less. So you eventually in a digital economy will have to come and reckon with that. At the same time, the way that people deal with the financialization of all of the things that have happened in the economy is that they try to hedge. And the problem with all of that is that it actually creates very interlinked dependencies. So it's a setup where on the one hand, the core underlying asset that people use to price risk is, it degrades in value by, 4, 5, 6% in a good year. And in a year like last year, 15, 20%, because we printed literally so much money on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have fundamental correlated risk with everything. So if you want some instrument of value to underpin a digital economy, it will have to be a cryptocurrency. And the more distributed it is, the less manipulated it can be. And so that's why crypto, and frankly, it's why Bitcoin. And then, if you then move past that and say, okay, how can we do functional things with all of that? Then you're probably in a world of DeFi and Ethereum, and that stuff.
No, this is absolutely incredible. I think maybe to put you on the spot, I don't think we've heard Vinod's comments on crypto, and I'm curious if you share the same opinion as Chamath.
So fundamentally, I think I see both the pros and cons. There's a lot of pros, and it helps break the ossified financial system. It bothers the hell out of me if you look at the financial services industry around Wall Street. Wall Street is in the business of helping the business of business, which is manufacturing autos, manufacturing services. And yet, when you look at the cumulative profits of the financial services sector, people who are in the business of helping other businesses make more money cumulatively than all the other industries combined. Now, any 1 year, that may not be true, but I think when I looked at it about 5 years ago, that was true. That just fundamentally feels wrong to me. And there's two things. One is the ossified system and related regulatory capture that perpetuates that system, and crypto frees that up. Decentralization is really, really important. The flip side of it that has bothered me is crypto has had two uses principally. One is speculation, which I think hurts a lot of people who can't afford to get hurt. And two, the vast majority of real business done with crypto is illegal and to violate regulatory for illegal activity, whether it's drugs or slave trading of children or guns, and that bothers me a lot. That this has been the principal problem with crypto. Having said that, I fundamentally think I'm optimistic about where crypto can go.
I want to do a couple more questions, and then we'll give you your time back. Question for you, Chamath. Do you think we as a society will be able to handle the negative effects of social media? And if you think it's a lot worse than we realize, what is the role technologists and entrepreneurs and engineers can play in helping solve that?
I think we're at the point where we found out that cigarettes cause cancer, and we're still feverishly smoking them because we think it still makes us look cool, even though it doesn't particularly add any value. And so, there is going to come a moment, I call it the Mike Bloomberg moment. And when Mike Bloomberg, who VK and I are both friends with, when Mike became mayor of New York City, one of the first things he did was he banned smoking. And it was a thunderclap. And now you guys probably don't even think it as abnormal, but there were places like we could, again, in the 90s, you'd still go into restaurants and people would be smoking section and non-smoking section. And after Mike shut down the smoking inside of restaurants and social areas, and also, there was a certain amount of feet within office buildings in New York, it was done. There's going to be a moment like that. Now, what is social media good for? I think you're starting to see a migration of behavior so that these tools start to become less of a Swiss Army knife, meaning it's not the point of one thing to do everything. It's the point of going to specific tools, specific purposes. So Instagram will be very much fashion related, ultra fashion related, fast fashion, ultra fast fashion, as an example. TikTok will become a much more consumable form of short form video. And it's going to be much more entertainment focused. Twitter is becoming much more content focused. And I think that segregation of behavior is the first step. And then the second step is going to be this, like I said, Mike Bloomberg moment where somebody says enough. And everybody says, you know what? Yeah, it's just way better without somebody, smoking a cigar beside me. It sucks. And secondhand smoke gives you cancer too. So we haven't gotten to that point yet, but I think that's where it's going. Again, don't work at big tech. Don't work at startup.
That's one clear takeaway. It seems to be the case. So we'll do this our final question to you, and want to thank all the time you've given us. And with that, I want to basically ask as our final question, what is kind of one thing that you wish people would ask you more? And we'll kind of just have that be included with any parting thoughts you'd like to share before you sign off. And maybe we can start with Vinod.
I don't know. I don't know if there's one thing, but I do think the value of role models is always underestimated. Chamath talked about his role models. I talked about Andy Grove and Wall Street. I like to say there was a time when the only role models one had was basketball players and football players. In the last 20 years, we've seen a very different model of the Larry Pages or the Jeff Bezos of the world emerge as role models. So I really wish people would focus more on that, what they've been able to achieve and contributed over time. So role models, I think, is the one thing I wish people would ask me more about or talk about.
I think that's amazing. I'll just second that because I think it's amazing. VK was a role model for me when I needed somebody to look up to. It also helped for me that he was South Asian, so he looked like me or I looked like him. That meant a lot to me. Not having met him was fine. Obviously, it was much better after I met him. But having these heroes and then seeing their path and the imperfect path is much more motivating. It's hard to look at LeBron and know that LeBron was the best basketball player since he was 14 years old and have him be your hero. That's impossible, to build on what VK said. But to go through the ups and downs and sort of come from, not so high expectations and to be able to achieve things and, have some stumbles and struggles and failures. And I think that richness is what heroes are about. So I would agree with that. Find people around that you look up to and, just admire them and just be motivated by them.
Chamath, Vinod, it's been great to see this live and the relationship that you have here. And thanks again for sharing this with 3,000 students.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Talk to you later. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.